right. So last week, Warren covered chapter 14 of Romans for us. I hope you were here, or that, like me, I wasn't, but I went and listened to it and watched it online on the YouTube channel because it was excellent. And what we're going to do today is a workshop building on that. So if you missed it, you really missed out. And I hope that you'll be able to participate well today. But the notes that he gave us also were very good summary on that subject. So I'm keeping those in my files, and I would encourage you to do the same. Interesting, in Romans 14, it mentions in verse 1, it says, "As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him." So it refers to a brother in Christ who is weak in faith, or a weaker brother. But then you'd think the opposite of that, the person he's speaking to, is what? The stronger brother. But he doesn't mention that. He says, one person, that's the stronger brother, believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. And it's interesting how he goes through this whole chapter without ever using the term stronger. It's just the other person. And it's the other person is always the stronger one. But he finally does mention it in chapter 6, which Warren also covered last week. I mean, chapter 15, the first 7 verses. We who are strong have an obligation to bear the failings of the weak. Another way of looking at that stronger brother is that he's convinced. In other words, he, unlike the weaker brother who's not sure about what is permissible as a Christian, the other brother is convinced that this is okay, or that's okay, or this is not okay, that is not okay for him. And so you got these two broad categories: the person who's convinced about certain things, which the Bible doesn't tell us what's right or wrong about them. He's convinced this is good for me, or this is not good for me. And on the other hand, you got the weaker brother who's not convinced about these things. He's a bit ignorant about them. And so the question is, how do we go from one to the other? How do we go from being the weaker brother to being the convinced or stronger brother? Is it a certain number of sermons we've sat through, a certain number of decades or years in the church? Does that automatically make us a stronger brother? I see some head shaking. Good. They're shaking this way, which is really good. At least it is here. I was in India. This is an aside, but I was in India in 1992, and I was the first one to have to get up. No, I take that back. It was another guy that was the first one. He had to get up and give a talk, and he asked the audience, "Are you following me?" And they were going. And so he repeated himself. Does that make sense? And so he said it in a different way. Does that make sense? Finally, the leader said, "In India, this means yes." It's like they're going, "That's so good." Yeah. So it's a good thing he clarified that the first day, or we would have been in trouble. That thing. Yeah. So it's not just sitting and listening, is it? So how do we do that? Well, I'll tell you a little story. I got ordained in 2007 or 8, I guess 7. And so my first General Assembly I got to go to as a commissioner, as an ordained teaching elder, was in 2008. And I found when you get there, they give you a card. It's about this size, and it's got printed on it, commissioner, and it's got a number. They only gave out a certain number of these. And the way you voted was they would have the debates, and then the person who was moderating, who that year happened to be Harry Reeder, would state, "This is what we're voting on. And so all in favor, raise your card." So if you want to vote yes, you raise your card. And each little section of about 100 people had a guy that was to count those and then go and give the guy the tally for his area. And so the story was, most of these things that we have to vote on, they're not right or wrong. We're not voting on, should we say that adultery is okay, or should we not? Because the Bible's clear on that one, right? It was like, at what age should children be allowed to join the church? Or how many elders should be allowed to attend General Assembly from each church? Those are matters of wisdom. They're not matters of right and wrong. Okay. And so a lot of us just didn't take the time to study all those overtures. And so the story was, what you do is you just sit where you can see Frank Barker. And when Frank raises his card, you raise yours. And I thought they told me that before the assembly, and I thought it was a joke. It was not a joke. And it was not just Briarwood people. There was a lot of people that wanted to sit over in that section where they could see Frank. And if Frank was asleep, which, sometimes he's asleep in meetings, and wasn't raising his card, it really created some consternation. People didn't know what they were supposed to do. Yes, I moved that we postpone this until Frank is awake. in another state, but he would look at Frank. So you're verifying what I said. It's true, right? That's right. Because Frank had studied these things and thought through them, and he was convinced in his mind of how he should vote on these things. Well, the fact that Frank was convinced, does that make it right for everyone? That's what we're talking about here, is you can come to a conclusion on a subject that you feel you're right about for you. And over the centuries, the church has differed on a lot of issues. There have been Christians have had a lot of different issues that they differ over: drinking wine in moderation, watching movies, using the internet, political party affiliation, appropriate clothing for women, attending live theater, dancing, playing guitars in church, taking money from the government, like a healthcare or installation actually taking government money, or back during COVID, people taking companies taking money from the government, churches taking money from the government. People have differed on their opinion on those things. And so really what we're talking about here is, how do we understand and apply these principles that Warren covered last week? How do we apply them in the different issues of life on which the Bible is silent, where it doesn't tell us anything about it, or it doesn't tell us enough to know what is right or wrong for everyone? And so when we want to find when we want to come to a conclusion for ourselves, we're basically talking about doing a topical study that would be looking at a few passages of Scripture, or maybe many passages of Scripture, depending on what we're talking about. And from that, coming up with some principles on which we will base our decision. But now part of that's going to be our life experiences, the home we came from. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to affect our decision, our background. So like one person, for example, on the issue of drinking wine in moderation, one person may come to the conclusion that that's not a problem for me. I go out and have a glass of wine with some friends maybe once a month or twice a month. It's no big deal. And they've never had a problem with alcohol. But then there's another person who's a believer who had a problem, who was an alcoholic before becoming a Christian. And so to do that for him or her could be a real problem. So they may decide that for them, they would never do that. And so it's not right or wrong for everyone. It's what's right or wrong for me or for you. And so that's a subject that we have to decide about. And on many of these subjects, we have the freedom to choose. God has given us that freedom, which is wonderful. When he told Adam not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what other trees did he tell him he could eat from? Yeah. Which one? Any of them. He can choose any of them. He didn't say, now, these are the ones I want you to eat from, this one and this one and this one. No, you can eat any of them, all of them, except for that one. And so we have a lot of freedom. And Romans 14 is a great passage on that. 1 Corinthians chapters 8 to 10 are also very good, cover things a little bit differently, but really help us out a lot. So what I want us to do today is I want us to not do the Frank Barker approach of saying, well, what does Frank think on this? Or what does so-and-so think on this? And that's my view, because I don't think that's really being convinced. If you're going to become convinced, you've got to think through it for yourself. You've got to look at some biblical principles, and you've got to look at your life, your situation, your circumstances, and then you come to a conclusion. What is right for you? Not just looking to see what someone else does. In fact, that's what this passage warns against. What happens to a weaker brother who's not convinced about something, and they see the older brother doing it? They think it's okay because this older brother does it. So then they go out and do it, but they may sin against their conscience. We're going to come to that a little bit later on. So we want to talk about the process, and that's why I call it a workshop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a controversial subject, and we're going to discuss how we might come to a conclusion about it. What kind of passages of Scripture, what kind of thought processes, what kind of circumstances might we be thinking about as we for ourselves try to decide what we would consider right or wrong. So we're not coming to a group decision of what's right for the church. We're coming to a decision of what's right for me. Okay? That's what we're trying to do. So we're gonna do that, and to kind of help facilitate things, I thought rather than taking some obscure, controversial subject that none of us have ever bothered to think about, I would take a subject that most of us probably gave some thought to at one point. And think back 5 years ago this month. There was an issue in our country to wear masks or not to wear masks. That was a big issue. It's a big issue in the church. I remember when we had a big issue at the school about that. And I happened to be sitting by a guy from one of the other churches in town, one of the other larger PCA churches at lunch. And he said, "What's happening at Briarwood these days?" So I said, "Well, funny you should ask that. We're having a big blow up because people at the school are being required to wear masks." And he said, "Oh, you too." He said, "We had a big problem last year on that, you know." And so it wasn't unique to us. It was all over the show. People were having issues about that. So we're told wear masks when you go outside. Where do you start in deciding, is this something I want to do or not do? Is this right for me, or is something I don't want to do? Where do you start? This is the time where I'm going to stop talking and you're going to start talking. Remember, you're thinking back. I know there's a lot of water under the bridge since 5 years ago this month, and we've learned a lot of new things about the whole issue, COVID issue. But I want you to try to put yourself back then. What were some thoughts that might have been going through your mind then, or things that you heard other people say to help make decisions on something like this? Yes, way back there. Liv.
To be fully educated on this subject, so I should honor those who apparently have more information than I do, at least initially.
Okay.
So honor and respect for those who presumably knew more than me.
Yes. Okay, good. Sally. Yes.
So God honoring and also
Self-preservation. Yeah.
those who be treated. People should treat that person. So we work with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Teresa.
Have authorities.
Submit it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's a good biblical principle. Keith.
Based on science. Science. Science.
That's what you were thinking at the time. Okay. Yeah, John.
Element of it of self-preservation. This is going to help me not get sick.
Okay.
And then there's also an element of well, my neighbor. I don't want to make my neighbor sick if I've got something.
Yeah. Okay. George.
Examine my sources of information and determine who I can trust.
All right, that's a good one. Because so that Linda was saying initially, some people seem to have thought about this and studied this, and so she's going to go with them initially. And so you're saying now start looking at some of these sources and seeing who you can trust, who you think's on target. Okay, good. That's good. That's a process. In other words, it's a process there, isn't it? All right. Was there another hand over here somewhere? Yeah.
Bobby, I used to see Japanese, just one type people, but they would wear masks a lot around, and people from some foreign countries that were in the US would wear masks. I can't remember which countries. I always thought that was weird. So that's my opinion. So if you tell me to wear a mask, I'm thinking those people look kind of weird.
Yeah, years before COVID, they were wearing masks in China because the air pollution was so bad.
There must be another reason why they wear a mask other than they're going to think COVID's going to start up in a few years.
Yeah, they're getting ready. That's a good, honest answer. Yeah. So what else? Yeah, David.
One of the things is that while we are responsible to answer to the government in obedience, the government is also to answer to God.
Mhm.
In other words, it's not us that controls that, but God will deal with them if they obey. And that's what we were, many of us were trying to, get around that. I mean, that's not right either
Mhm.
for us to judge the government per se.
All right. What else?
We're all walking around the neighborhood a lot because it was a beautiful spring. And I remember wearing a mask just to fulfill all righteousness. I didn't think we really needed to wear it outside, but I thought, and if somebody was going to talk to me about not wearing masks, I said, well, I'm just doing it because of spring allergies. And so, I would wear it and some people were and some people weren't in our neighborhood. And I just thought, well, I'm going to wear it just to not to cause anybody an offense. And it'll probably help with allergies too, because there were a lot of allergies, so I just kind of, I wasn't really sure what to do, but I thought, I'll just err on the side of not offending my neighbors,
Okay.
because I was always thinking about wanting to reach out to them
Mhm.
as a Christian.
Okay, that's good. That's a good perspective, Keith.
So someone asked me to wear a mask, I would say, show me the scientific study that says I should wear a mask.
Mhm.
Because all of us in the medical community, what we do is based on scientific studies
Mhm.
for the most part.
For the most part.
Although the flu rate did go down dramatically.
The what? The flu rate. All right, what else? This is good, yeah.
But forgive me, don't remember when you went, it tells you that are older in this class. Dentists used to not wear masks at all. Dentists, they would not wear masks. I remember going to the dentist and there was no mask and then
Right.
all of a sudden they started wearing gloves, masks, so. That was, so there's gotta be a reason for it. For that reason, you're spitting stuff out of your mouth and stuff, so.
Mhm. Good. Yeah,
Similar topic around that time of vaccines, several people in the medical community who refused to take the vaccine.
it was one of those controversial issues. Yeah. That's right. Let's stick with math so we don't get too complicated here. We're talking about just learn the process. We're not going to decide today. In fact, most of you made a decision way back then because you had to, one way or the other. But we're talking about a process. How do we come to a conclusion of what's right for me in this subject? Yeah.
Just remember feeling like I couldn't be personable with people in the grocery store and other places because, you know, you couldn't see a smile.
Yeah.
And so when you talk to people, so you could just maybe, you couldn't have, I mean, I don't know, it was just, I just remember feeling that we lost that for a while.
Yeah.
It was sad.
It was very impersonal, you know? Yeah. Good. Okay, so these are some of the thoughts that we've had. What conclusions did you come to? Anyone come to a conclusion that they were not going to wear a mask except in places where they're absolutely required to enter? It's okay if you did. We can differ on these things, but anyone decide if I go into a doctor's office or someplace like that where I'm required to wear a mask, I'll wear one, but otherwise I'm not going to. Anyone do that? Oh, come on, we need some controversy here. Yes.
You know, wear a mask most of the time, yes, but when I was in the car, no. If I was in my house, no. If I was out for a walk and there was no one else around me, I did not wear a mask. My patients, especially my elderly patients, we were very limited on who we could treat. And so our numbers, you know, per hour, what we did. But I noticed a decrease in the respiration rate of my elderly patients not taking the deeper breaths, okay? So what I would ask them, for science on what we were studying, that breathing was getting less. So I would say, take your mask, pull it out. I want you to hold your breath 20-30 seconds to increase that. And then we would take deep breaths, 3 deep breaths to increase. So I don't know.
So you were modifying things as you saw best.
Environment
Yeah.
To
Okay.
improve their health.
Yeah.
But, so that was my assessment.
Okay. Yeah.
Mark's mom, Sister Living, after a lot of gymnastics, because everybody was trying to figure everything out, we could go visit, you know, the big plexiglass between us, and she had to be blocked out. And we were supposed to wear a mask, and she was supposed to wear a mask. And she has hearing aids, but she can't hear that well, so I cheated, I would pull my mask below my chin. And I'm on the other side of the plexiglass and I had, you know, baptized my hands and because she could not, and her son,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
so she depends on watching.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she would pull her mask down. We were cheating because if the staff came nearby, we would both.
Yeah, right.
She was. The whole situation did isolate.
Yeah. It really isolated the elderly good. Yeah. Very difficult for them. Some of them suffered. David, you had another comment?
One of the things that became apparent was that even the medical industry itself began to kind of back off from a lot of their requirements. They began to say, well, really, the mask only helps a little bit here. It does not really protect from getting COVID. And they were seeing that the results really were not changing as they predicted it would.
Mhm.
Yeah, the mask did help.
But not.
Oh, yeah, well, nothing was perfect. Nothing was perfect.
Yeah.
But- Yeah, but, yeah, wearing the mask, in my mind was, yeah, some of it's self-preservation, but a big portion of it was watching out for other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so let's think about this, and then I want to move on to something else. Did any of you come to one conclusion, and then as you continue to study, as Linda and a couple others have commented, change your opinion on that subject? Some people, I see some heads nodding, yes,
I changed my opinion
okay,
from what to.
right, but it was through what? Study?
Just in getting better educated.
Yeah.
And I think that was true for whole society. We started at one point.
Yes.
We're all learning.
Mhm.
throughout the-
Yeah. Well, the reason I bring that up is we've seen that happen in our lives. When we went to South Africa, I had never been a person that drank alcohol, but over there, everyone drinks beer and wine. It's like water. It's kind of like Germany. And you heard about the German Christian who heard that American Christians didn't drink beer. He said, God, thank you that I'm a German Christian. So we would be invited to someone's house, and all they would offer us to drink was a glass of wine. And so eventually we decided, well, might as well, gotta drink something. So we started drinking wine, and we didn't buy any. We just drank it when we were with someone that offered it, which was maybe once a month or something like that. And we did that. And I didn't have any problems of conscience about it, that I was sinning. Okay. It just seemed like a good way to fit in. But then fast forward, we had kids. And when the kids got to be our oldest about 5 years old, we thought, we can understand these things, that there's some things that are okay for Christians and some things that are not. But we're not sure we can explain that to a 5-year-old. So rather than having the questions come up, we'll just stop drinking wine when we're with people so she doesn't ask those questions. And so we know that we made a change because of our circumstances. And so that's okay to do that. So what I want to do now is I got some stuff on PowerPoint that I want to show you, which I think will help clarify some issues in regards to how we deal with these things. And so let's see here, see if that does the job. It does? Okay. What causes this to move? Nothing is moving it, Warren.
John, can you come? What?
Get the mouse, click on power. Either alt tab or to click it.
Yeah, something briefly.
And then use the right arrow down.
All right, now we got it.
There you go.
So
Thank you.
we're talking about here categories of differing brothers and sisters. Okay, so weaker and convinced or stronger brothers, what we're talking about. So let's look at a little profile of these. The weaker brother is sincere, but not fully convinced. In other words, probably hasn't had time to study and think through these things on whatever the subject may be. We can forget about masks right now. Think about any other controversial subject in the church. So he's not really fully convinced, and he needs teaching. And being a younger brother, he knows he needs teaching. I met with a guy this week that came into the office, and he's been a Christian a few weeks, and he said, I just know nothing. I need to be taught. I said, great. So we're going to start meeting on Wednesday this week and just going through basic things that he needs to know as a new believer. So this is what we're talking about, a person that's open to teaching. He's surprised at my use of freedom. In other words, a weaker brother may see you doing something which is in this issue of it's a debatable issue. Each Christian can decide for themselves, but because of their background, maybe they think, well, Christians don't do that. And then they see you doing it, and it kind of surprises them. I thought Christians didn't do those things, so something like that. He does not think he can teach me. In other words, he's a younger, weaker Christian. And so he looks at me, you, those of us who've been at it for a longer time, and he doesn't think he has anything to teach us. Okay. He is influenced by my example, though. In other words, because he sees you're an older Christian, you've been at this a long time. If you're doing this, you're drinking wine, you're dancing, you're doing whatever things that I used to think were bad, it must be okay. Well, is it okay? I'm not sure, but he's doing it, so I'll do it. So you see what he's doing there is he's going against his conscience because he thinks it's not good, but he sees you doing it, so he does it anyway. And that's bad. Why is it bad for a person to sin against their conscience?
Because they're unsure.
Because they're unsure.
They're being faithful to God or not.
That's right. And you think about this. Sinning against your conscience means you're doing something that you think is wrong, but you do it anyway. And that in itself is wrong. To think, even if it's not wrong, because it's one of those areas that's an area of freedom, but you think it's wrong and you do it anyway, that in itself is a bad thing because now you're doing something that you think is wrong. So that's the problem with our influence on them. He's caused to sin by my wrong use of freedom. In other words, I'm using it in the wrong way or wrong time, wrong place, whatever. And so it causes this person to sin. And when I cause him to stumble, it is an offense given. There's a difference. We're going to see that in a minute. There's a difference between giving offense, and that would be me giving offense because I do something that I have the freedom to do, but I shouldn't be doing it in his presence. The author of this book that I got this charts out of, Decision Making in the Will of God, Gary Friesen, tells a true story. When he was a young boy, he was on his way from one place to another, and he needed to get there in a certain period of time. And he came across a field that normally he just went across that field. There was no one there. That's just the way he went, like to school or to ball practice or something. He always went that way. And he got to the edge of that field and he noticed that there were these targets over there and these guys over on the other side of the field shooting arrows at him. Do people have the freedom to shoot arrows at targets? Yes, there's nothing illegal or immoral about that or unscriptural. You can shoot an arrow at a target. But he realized that to go around this field was going to make him late. So he watched when a bunch of guys shot, and then he went running across in between. But one guy had not shot and shot his arrow, and it barely missed him. And so he said, in that situation, the guy should have limited his freedom. He should have noticed this little boy running across. I should not shoot my arrow because I might hurt him or kill him, right? So something that would normally be an area of freedom, he shouldn't be doing. And so that's giving offense when we do something which causes a problem to the other person. All right, so let's look at the convinced brother. He's fully convinced and humble. In other words, he's thought through it, but because he's changed his views, like we've all said we do from time to time, he's learned, okay, this is where I'm at right now in my view, but I could be wrong. Okay, so he's humble about it. He's been taught, but he's open to correction. Again, he's humble. He's willing to learn from somebody else. And that's a good thing. The third thing, he accepts me with my differing opinion. Part of being a convinced brother is I'm convinced that this is okay for me. If you think otherwise for you, that's fine for you. Because I realize here's an issue where we have the freedom to make our own choice. And if you come to that conclusion, then you can be convinced. And if another brother who's convinced has a different opinion, that's okay. Not a problem. Okay. He's willing to discuss why he differs. That could be a good thing. Two people who differ, who are convinced brothers on these issues, can sit down and talk, and they can learn from one another. The one may persuade the other, maybe not, but they can learn from one another and why the other person thinks the way they do. He is not improperly influenced by my example because he's convinced of his views. So what I do doesn't bother him. And he is not caused to sin by my use of freedom. he realizes he's got the freedom to make his choice on these subjects. I have my freedom. So it doesn't cause him to sin. And since he does not stumble, there's no offense at all. Okay. So that's that brother. Now, at that point, things are pretty simple, and it looks like easy and simple. If everybody was like that and everybody operated that way, it would be pretty good. But there is another type of brother that I want to talk about before we talk about how we actually relate to differing brothers. And that's another one that I didn't mention in the categories at the beginning, and that's a Pharisee. So a Pharisee is a person who's fully convinced, but instead of being humble, he's proud. He's proud that he's right about everything. You ever been around somebody like that? I have. It's not fun. He has been taught, but is not open to correction. That was me once upon a time. And as I think I've told you before, my first job as a director in South Africa, my nickname was the Abominable No Man, because I often just said no because it wasn't my way. People wanted to do something, it wasn't my way, so I say no. And that's how I got the nickname. And so that's not a good thing, to be proud and to be not open to correction. This Pharisee is also judges or rejects me for my differing opinion. That was me once upon a time again. And I've certainly been on the other end of that, where people have been that way with me. The Pharisee is known for seeking to make me conform to his viewpoint. I had a guy that's probably spent 30 hours in my office some years ago trying to convince me of his viewpoint. And I would try to go over this stuff with him and let him know that it's okay if you think that way. Now, this was not a new Christian. This guy had been a Christian probably 30 years. He'd studied the Bible. He'd taught the Bible. He'd done a lot of evangelism. So he wasn't a weaker brother, but he was a Pharisee, because unless you agreed with him on every point on the subject he was wanting to talk to you about, he was going to continually twist your arm and give you another book to read and another video to watch and this, until he could persuade you of his way of doing things. Now, that's what I mean by trying to conform you to his viewpoint. He is not influenced by my example. Why is he not influenced by my example? Because he knows it all. I have nothing to teach him. So it's not a problem. And the reason is he knows he's right about everything. And then his pride will cause him to stumble. It's not me that's causing him to stumble. It's his pride that's causing him to stumble. And I think there's one more there. Yeah. He becomes upset by my use of freedom. This guy that I was talking about, he'd get very upset because I would choose to act in freedom in an area that he wanted me to act his way. Very difficult. So how do we relate to these differing brothers? Well, no, there's one more, sorry. When he stumbles over my freedom, it is an offense taken. Remember we talked about an offense given? That's when a stronger brother does something that causes offense to the weaker brother. But this is not a weaker brother. So I'm not doing anything wrong, but he takes offense. Can you think of a biblical example of that? When Jesus went to his hometown of Nazareth, it says they took offense at him. In other words, there are many other examples in the New Testament. That's just one, where it's not that Jesus did something wrong that caused them to be offended. It was the Pharisees took offense because they didn't like what he was doing. Okay.
Healing on the Sabbath.
Yeah, healing on the Sabbath was one of those things. And so it's very different. So how do we relate to these differing brothers? Well, with a weaker brother, and Warren covered this last week, I don't want to belabor it. I never need give him offense. I can become a willing slave to his conscience, and I must limit my freedom to avoid sinning against him. In other words, the idea here is when it's necessary, I limit my freedom. Let me just read you what it says in a parallel passage in Galatians 5. You were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. So in other words, if you've decided, let's take the area of drinking alcohol. That's a pretty common one in our culture. You decide there's no problem with you drinking alcohol in moderation, not getting drunk, obviously, but in moderation. It's not a problem for you. You're fully convinced that that's okay. And you're around other brothers who think the same, and you're around some brothers who are convinced brothers who have the opposite view, but it's not a problem. But now you're in a situation where there's a weaker brother there, like I said earlier, who may have come from an alcoholic home, or maybe he himself had a problem with alcohol. Now you limit your freedom for that person. It becomes necessary to limit your freedom for that other person. What about with a convinced brother? Well, I'm not going to be able to give him offense because he's convinced about his views and it works for him. I'm free to exercise my freedom. I need not limit my freedom on his account. And here's the difficult one. What about the Pharisee? How do I relate to the Pharisee? Well, I will not be able to prevent his taking offense. In other words, he knows what he knows. He's right about everything. And so no matter what I do, if it's not what he wants, he's going to be offended. And so there's nothing I can do about that. And I will not allow him to enslave me to his standards. Jesus did not give in to the Pharisees, and neither do we have to. So we don't have to do what the Pharisees want. But I may choose to limit my freedom to keep him from getting upset with me. And I tried that with this one guy where I would just avoid talking about the issues that were hot buttons for him when he was around. And I thought that would help me avoid getting him upset with me. But it didn't, because he knew that I had these views. So he would make an appointment and come to my office to try to convince me of his views. So it can be very difficult in situations like that. So the emphasis in Romans 14, I believe, is one, for us to determine our convictions on these controversial subjects, not just go with the flow or go with the Frank Barker approach. Frank raises his hand, I go with it, but really think through it. Study the scriptures, think through it. If you're married, discuss it with your spouse. And then secondly, the emphasis on caring for the weaker brother. We always want to be aware of the need of the weaker brother. So I hope this workshop was a little bit helpful. I wanted to try to get us to talk through these things to see the process, because I think too often we don't do that. Next week, we're going to go beyond chapter 14. We will look at Romans 15. So please read and study Romans 15 for next week. Let me pray. Lord, thank you for loving us and giving us your word, and pray that you'd help us to apply these things for our benefit and for your glory and for the good of your church. In Jesus' name, amen.